In the final years leading to World War II, the Pacific Ocean became the stage for one of the most dramatic contrasts in military philosophy ever witnessed in human history. Japan, proud and ancient, armed with a tradition of warrior spirit and naval ambition, sent forth 18 mighty battleships into the vast expanse of the Pacific, each representing decades of craftsmanship, national pride, and the belief that naval supremacy depended on the thunder of heavy guns. These steel giants, the likes of Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, and Fuso, symbolized the pinnacle of Japan's maritime power. They were floating fortresses designed for one purpose: to annihilate the enemy fleet in a decisive gun duel that would determine the fate of empires. Japan's admirals and shipbuilders poured their souls into these colossal machines, believing the battleship to be the heart of a nation's might. With guns that could hurl shells weighing more than a ton over 20 miles, these monsters of steel embodied the ancient dream of domination through firepower. But while Japan's industrial base strained every resource to feed the battleship obsession, an entirely different storm was brewing across the Pacific. In America's sprawling shipyards, a new concept of warfare was taking shape, one that valued mobility, versatility, and the skies above the sea more than the size of a gun. After the humiliation of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States unleashed an industrial revolution on a scale the world had never imagined. Entire cities became engines of production, steel mills ran 24 hours a day, men and women filled the factories, welding, hammering, and riveting for victory. From this unrelenting machine rose the Essex-Class aircraft carrier, a vessel that would forever redefine naval warfare. While Japan sent 18 battleships into combat, the United States built 151 Essex-Class carriers in just 4 years, a staggering achievement that transformed the balance of power. Each carrier, carrying around 100 aircraft, represented more than firepower. It was a floating airbase, a mobile island capable of unleashing devastation over hundreds of miles. For every Japanese battleship that sailed proudly into the sea, America answered with a fleet of floating airfields, each one capable of launching swarms of fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes. The difference was not merely numerical, it was philosophical, technological, and existential. Japan believed in the past, in honor, in steel and gunpowder. America believed in progress, in industry, and in the boundless potential of air power. As the war unfolded, that difference became the deciding factor in the Pacific's fate. The Imperial Japanese Navy's mighty battleships, products of years of perfection, began to realize their obsolescence. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 served as the first devastating revelation. Japan lost 4 carriers in a single engagement, and with them, much of its experienced air crews and tactical edge. The Americans, with their production lines working like clockwork, simply built replacements faster than they could be sunk. The Essex-Class ships began pouring out of American shipyards like an unstoppable tide, each one a symbol of industrial supremacy. By 1943, while Japan struggled to repair or build even a handful of vessels, the United States had already constructed dozens of new carriers and trained thousands of new pilots to man them. Japan's shipyards, once symbols of imperial pride, were now targets themselves, bombed, blockaded, and starved of raw materials. The dreams of decisive gun duels evaporated as American planes struck from beyond the horizon, their bombs and torpedoes falling upon ships that never saw their enemy. The once proud battleships, those floating temples of steel, found themselves helpless beneath skies dominated by aircraft they could not reach. The Yamato and Musashi, Japan's crowning achievements, both met their ends not in glorious battle but under relentless air assault, swarmed by hundreds of aircraft from American carriers that outnumbered them and outmaneuvered them. In April 1945, during Operation Tengo, the Yamato sailed on her final mission, a desperate one-way journey toward Okinawa, carrying enough fuel for only half the trip. She never reached her destination. Waves of American planes descended upon her from the decks of Essex-Class carriers, striking her with bombs and torpedoes until she erupted in a cataclysmic explosion, sinking beneath the waves with over 3,000 men aboard. That moment, tragic and awe-inspiring, marked not just the death of a ship, but the death of an idea, the end of the battleship era and the beginning of the age of air power. America's 151 Essex-Class carriers now ruled the seas, forming floating armadas that could strike anywhere, anytime, with impunity. The ocean that once seemed vast became small under their shadow. From the Central Pacific to the shores of Japan, these carriers carried the war forward like a tide no empire could resist. Each one bore a crew of thousands, pilots who learned to land on pitching decks in storms, mechanics who kept engines alive in tropical heat, and gunners who watched the skies for kamikazes. Together, they embodied a new kind of warfare, one that fused technology, teamwork, and sheer industrial capacity into a single unstoppable force. Japan's admirals, bound by the code of Bushido and the dreams of the past, could not adapt quickly enough to the reality of this transformation. Their pilots were brave, their ships majestic, but courage could not compete with quantity and innovation. As American carriers struck at Truk, Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa, the Japanese navy dwindled, its proud battleships turned into floating tombs or left rusting in harbors, unable to sail for lack of fuel. America's shipyards, meanwhile, continued their miraculous pace. Every few weeks, a new Essex-class carrier slid into the water, christened by women who had built them with their own hands. This was the true miracle of democracy at war, an entire nation united behind one purpose, transforming civilian factories into war engines and ordinary people into the builders of history. By the time Japan's surrender came in August 1945, the numbers told a story beyond imagination. Japan's 18 battleships had vanished, most sunk, others crippled, all rendered useless. The United States, by contrast, commanded an ocean-spanning fleet of over 100 carriers, each a symbol of technological dominance. The Pacific, once the dream of the Japanese Empire, had become an American lake. The lesson of those years was written not in ideology but in iron and innovation. The United States had proven that wars are not merely contests of courage but of adaptation, that the future belongs to those who can imagine beyond tradition. Japan's 18 battleships were masterpieces of engineering, but they represented a philosophy that could not survive the modern age. America's 151 Essex-class carriers, mass-produced yet magnificent, embodied the power of modern industry and foresight. They were the instruments of a new world order, where control of the skies would forever decide the fate of the seas. Even today, decades after the guns fell silent, the wrecks of those battleships lie deep beneath the waves, silent and solemn, reminders of a time when pride blinded vision. Above them, the story of the Essex-class carriers continues in every modern naval vessel that carries aircraft into battle. The echoes of those 4 years, 1941 to 1945, still shape naval strategy today. It was not simply a contest between ships, it was a contest between eras, between past and future, between the old gods of steel and the new gods of flight. Japan had sent 18 battleships to defend an empire. America had built 151 carriers to build a new kind of power, one based not on fear, but on reach, flexibility, and unrelenting productivity. And in that vast crucible of war, one truth became undeniable: in the age of machines and men, victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the one who can change fastest. As the smoke of war cleared and the shattered remains of the Imperial Japanese Navy sank to the bottom of the Pacific, the full scale of what had happened began to emerge in the minds of historians, soldiers, and the nations that had fought. Japan had entered the war believing that the spirit of the samurai, the sharp edge of discipline, and the sheer weight of battleship guns could overcome even the vastness of the American continent. Yet what unfolded was a story not merely of courage or destruction, but of evolution itself, a technological revolution that transformed the sea into an arena of machines. The Japanese battleships, those 18 mighty steel titans, had once stood as the pride of an empire that dreamed of ruling the Pacific. They were designed with obsession, layers of armor feet thick, turrets that could pulverize mountains, engines capable of propelling the massive hulls through waves with unstoppable momentum. But while Japan poured its heart and fortune into these floating fortresses, America was reshaping the very idea of war. The Essex-class carrier was not built for prestige, it was built for purpose. Each one represented the triumph of simplicity, standardization, and efficiency. The Americans understood that the new weapon of dominance would not be the ship itself, but what it could carry. From their decks, aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat, SB-2C Helldiver, and TBF Avenger took to the skies, extending the reach of naval power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. The Japanese never truly grasped the magnitude of this shift until it was far too late. While they continued to focus on the glory of battleships and the valor of close combat, the Americans had mastered the art of remote destruction, striking unseen, striking first, and striking hard. The difference between the two nations' strategies was like the difference between a swordsman and a rifleman meeting on the same field. One still trusted the blade, while the other had already embraced the bullet. As American carriers fanned across the Pacific, Japan's naval command found itself trapped in an impossible game of reaction. Their few remaining carriers, hastily built or converted, lacked the training crews, aircraft, and logistical support needed to compete. The mighty battleships that once symbolized their invincibility became burdens instead of assets, too large to hide, too slow to reposition, and too vulnerable to the aerial onslaughts that came day after day. The Pacific sky, once dominated by the rising sun, now belonged to the White Star and Blue Circle of the United States Navy. Even the very geography of war had changed. Islands once vital for refueling or staging were now bypassed entirely as American carrier groups brought their own floating air bases wherever they sailed. The Essex-Class became the backbone of this strategy, fast enough to move with speed, large enough to carry devastating air wings, and numerous enough that losing one was no longer a catastrophe. Japan, by contrast, could not replace what it lost. Its shipyards, bombed relentlessly by B-29s, could barely repair damage, let alone construct new vessels. The resources that had once fueled its military might, oil, steel, rubber, had been cut off by Allied blockades. The empire that had begun the war with confidence and thunder now found itself shrinking, bleeding, and cornered. By late 1944, when the Battle of Leyte Gulf erupted, the largest naval battle in history, the contrast between Japan's dwindling fleet and America's industrial avalanche could not have been clearer. Japan sent what remained of its proud battleships, including the Yamato and Nagato, into a desperate gamble to halt the American invasion of the Philippines. The plan was bold but doomed, a complex trap meant to lure American forces into divided engagements. But against them sailed the might of dozens of American carriers, hundreds of escort ships, and thousands of aircraft. The result was devastation. Japanese ships that had taken years to build were destroyed in hours. The Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, was sunk under waves of aerial torpedoes and bombs before she could fire effectively. Her death marked not just another loss for Japan but a statement written in flame: no armor was thick enough, no gun large enough, to resist the fury of air power. The Americans, meanwhile, learned and adapted with every engagement. Their pilots grew sharper, their tactics more refined, their machines more reliable. They fought as a single organism, ship, plane, and crew in perfect harmony. Each Essex-class carrier became a world unto itself, a living city at sea, where hundreds of men and machines worked in rhythm to launch wave after wave of destruction. And as each victory came, new carriers were already being launched back home, ensuring that the momentum never slowed. Japan could not match it. Its admirals could only watch as their empire was erased piece by piece, their fleets shattered, their cities burned, their hopes drowned. By 1945, the transformation was complete. The ocean that once defined Japan's power had become the source of its defeat. The Essex-class carriers, products of relentless innovation and democratic industrial might, stood as the ultimate expression of modern war, efficient, lethal, and utterly adaptable. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war, the Essex-class carriers were already preparing for their next roles, as guardians of the post-war order, symbols of a new world shaped not by old traditions, but by technology and production. Japan's 18 battleships had entered history as magnificent relics of a vanished era, monuments to human pride and craftsmanship but also to the inability to change. America's 151 Essex-class carriers, on the other hand, became the blueprint for the future, the forerunners of the modern supercarrier, the vessels that would project power across every ocean for decades to come. The lesson of their creation and deployment was not confined to that war alone, it was a lesson about civilization itself. Those who adapt survive, those who cling to the past perish. The Pacific War had proven this beyond any argument. The Industrial Revolution that began in American shipyards during those 4 years reshaped not only the map but the very nature of global power. No longer would nations measure might by the thickness of armor or the size of guns, but by the reach of their aircraft, the speed of their production, and the innovation of their engineers. The image of Japan's 18 battleships, majestic and doomed, steaming proudly toward battles they could not win, remains one of the most haunting in history. The image of America's 151 carriers, spreading across the ocean like wings of an eagle, remains one of the most triumphant. Between them lies the story of an age ending and another beginning, the final chapter of the battleship's reign and the first of the aircraft carrier's dominion. It was not just the story of Japan and America, but the story of humanity learning, through fire and loss, that the future belongs to those who build it faster, smarter, and together. When the last echoes of gunfire faded across the Pacific in 1945, the scale of transformation that had taken place beneath those vast blue waters was beyond imagination. The war that began as a clash of fleets had ended as a revolution in human warfare, and the story of Japan's 18 battleships and America's 151 Essex-Class carriers stood as its clearest symbol. Japan had entered the conflict with an unshakable faith in the battleship, in the towering giants of steel whose very presence inspired awe and fear. Each of those ships, from the legendary Yamato to the aging Nagato, represented the pinnacle of naval craftsmanship, decades of experience, and a culture that believed war was an art of courage and precision. Yet courage could not stand against the power of industry, and precision could not compete with production. America, once considered a sleeping giant, had woken to become a colossus of creation, turning its entire continent into an arsenal of democracy. Its shipyards at Newport News, Brooklyn, San Francisco, and Puget Sound roared like furnaces of destiny, spitting out vessels faster than Japan could even plan them. The Essex-Class carriers were born not from luxury but necessity, designed for mass production, easy modification, and relentless efficiency. Each ship was a floating city, brimming with men and machines, ready to project power thousands of miles from home. For every Japanese ship sunk, America replaced it twice over. The Pacific became a chessboard where Japan's once dominant pieces were systematically removed by an opponent whose supply never ran out. By 1944, Japan's proud fleet had become a ghost of its former self, scattered and desperate, hiding in lagoons and bays to avoid the wrath of American carrier air groups. The age of the battleship had died, not in ceremony, but in silence, extinguished by squadrons of aircraft that struck from beyond the horizon. The very concept of naval warfare had changed forever. Before the war, admirals measured power in guns, armor, and tonnage. By its end, they measured it in aircraft capacity, radar systems, and flight decks. Japan's admirals, men like Yamato and Nagumo, had foreseen this shift in theory but could not overcome the weight of their own tradition. They had built an empire on the dream of a single decisive battle, a modern Tsushima that would crush the enemy fleet in one heroic encounter. But the Pacific War did not unfold that way. It became a war of attrition, of logistics, of machines and manpower. The United States had all three in endless supply, Japan had none to spare. Each Essex-Class carrier that entered service carried within it not just planes and pilots, but the will of a nation united in purpose. America's industrial might turned the concept of naval warfare into something mathematical, each ship a node in a vast machine, each pilot a cog in a larger design. Unable to replace its ships, pilots, or fuel, found itself drowning in the very ocean it once sought to dominate. The final years of the war brought the ultimate humiliation for the Imperial Navy. The Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, was sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa with barely enough fuel to reach her destination. She never made it. Over 300 American aircraft, mostly from Essex-Class carriers, attacked her relentlessly, dropping bombs and torpedoes until the great ship erupted in an explosion so massive it could be seen 50 miles away. With her, Japan's dream of naval supremacy died. The Pacific had become America's domain, and the Essex-Class carrier its new symbol of authority. These carriers were not just ships, they were instruments of global strategy, tools that extended America's reach across oceans and continents. Even after Japan's surrender, they continued to shape history. They became the backbone of post-war power, used in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, adapting to jet aircraft, nuclear weapons, and new forms of warfare. Japan, meanwhile, lay in ruins, its proud navy dismantled, its shipyards silent. Yet from those ruins, a new nation would rise, one that embraced the very principles it had once ignored. In the decades after 1945, Japan transformed itself from a militarist empire into a technological powerhouse, mastering production, efficiency, and innovation. Ironically, it became the very kind of industrial force that had once defeated it. The Essex-Class carriers, meanwhile, continued to evolve, serving the United States for decades, refitted and rearmed, symbols of longevity and adaptation. They stood as living proof that the power of progress outlives the power of pride. The wrecks of Japan's battleships still lie beneath the Pacific, silent monuments to an era that refused to change. Above them, the descendants of the Essex-Class, nuclear-powered supercarriers, continue to patrol the same waters, reminders that the lesson of that war remains eternal. In the struggle between tradition and innovation always wins. The Pacific War was more than a conflict of nations, it was a test of humanity's ability to adapt, to learn, and to transform. Japan's 18 battleships were masterpieces of design, but they belonged to a world that had already passed away. America's 151 Essex-Class carriers were imperfect, hastily built, and mass-produced, yet they were the vessels of the future. That contrast defines the legacy of the war more powerfully than any single battle. It tells us that power is not found in perfection but in production, not in the few but in the many. As long as ships sail the seas, the story of those 4 years, 1941 to 1945, will be remembered as the moment when humanity changed the nature of war forever. When history finally closed the chapter on World War II, and the fires that had devoured cities, oceans, and hearts began to fade, what remained was not only the rubble of nations but the foundation of a new world order. The war in the Pacific had not merely been a clash of armies, it was the most complete demonstration of how technology, industry, and imagination could reshape the fate of humanity. The comparison between Japan's 18 battleships and America's 151 Essex-Class carriers became more than a statistic, it became a parable of progress. Japan's naval command had entered the war with the mind of warriors, seeing the ocean as a place of honor, where mighty ships would exchange thunder and fire until one side stood victorious. But America entered it with the mind of builders, men who saw war as a problem to be solved, a system to be engineered. The result was inevitable. While Japan poured its dwindling steel and fuel into maintaining a handful of magnificent warships, America poured its industrial soul into multiplying its power 100-fold. Each Essex-Class carrier that slid into the Pacific was a symbol of something larger, of factories turned to fortresses, of citizens turned to soldiers of production, of an idea that democracy, when mobilized, could become the most formidable weapon of all. When Japan's last battleships fell silent, and her cities lay in ashes, the lesson was carved not only into textbooks but into the conscience of the world. Greatness in war no longer belonged to those who built the biggest guns, but to those who could see the horizon before others. The Essex-Class carrier was the embodiment of that vision. In less than 4 years, America had created a fleet that could encircle the globe, project its air power anywhere, and dominate not through numbers alone, but through innovation. Even as the ink dried on Japan's surrender in September 1945, the American Navy was already looking ahead, redesigning flight decks for jet aircraft, adding radar systems, improving catapults, inventing angled runways that would make takeoffs and landings safer. The Essex-Class was not just a warship, it was a foundation, a prototype for everything that would follow. In the years that came after, as the Cold War began and new threats rose across the world, these carriers continued to serve, modernized and reimagined. They fought again in Korea, in Vietnam, and stood watch through the tense decades when nuclear fire loomed as the next apocalypse. Japan, meanwhile, under the guidance of its new constitution and American Reconstruction, transformed itself not into a defeated empire but into a peaceful powerhouse, an industrial miracle that rivaled the very nation that had once destroyed it. The irony of history was poetic. Japan, crushed by American industry, rose again by mastering that very same force. The shipyards that had once forged battleships now built tankers, cargo vessels, and commercial ships that sailed every sea, symbols of recovery rather than conquest. And in that transformation lay the quiet redemption of a nation that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the sword may win battles, but the mind wins wars. The ghosts of those 18 battleships, sleeping beneath the waves, were not only reminders of defeat but of the cost of refusing to evolve. Their silent hulks became museums of pride and tragedy, attracting divers, historians, and dreamers who came to touch the remains of a vanished age. Yet above those same oceans, America's descendants of the Essex-Class still sailed, now massive nuclear-powered carriers, cities unto themselves, with flight decks longer than football fields and the ability to launch planes that could cross continents. These ships were the living legacy of what began in 1941, the proof that adaptability is the true weapon of the modern age. As the 20th century moved forward, and wars became colder, more political, and more technological, the doctrine born in the Essex-Class era defined every navy that followed. Nations no longer built battleships, they built carriers. Aircraft became the kings of combat, missiles their heirs, and space the next frontier. The Japanese lesson became a universal one, that tradition must yield to innovation, or perish beneath it. The Pacific, once the graveyard of fleets, became the highway of commerce, peace, and alliance. America and Japan, once mortal enemies, became partners, their combined navies patrolling the same waters not in hostility, but in harmony. And every time a U.S. carrier, descendant of the Essex Line, docked at Yokosuka or sailed through the Philippine Sea, it carried with it the memory of that transformation, from enemies to allies, from destruction to creation. The story of those 18 battleships and 151 carriers thus transcends the war that birthed it. It is the story of humanity's greatest contradiction, our capacity to destroy and to rebuild, to repeat mistakes and to learn from them. The Essex-Class carriers taught the world that power was no longer about size, but about reach, no longer about brute force, but about the ability to change. And in the decades after World War II, that idea shaped not only military strategy but the very psychology of nations. Superpowers rose and fell by how quickly they could adapt to new technologies, nuclear power, computers, satellites, all descendants, in spirit, of that same lesson learned in the Pacific. When Japan's 18 battleships sailed, they represented the last roar of an age obsessed with glory and grandeur. When America's 151 carriers sailed, they represented the dawn of an age obsessed with progress and possibility. Between those two visions lay the entire arc of modern history. It was a transformation paid for in blood, sweat, and steel, millions dead, oceans burned, skies blackened with smoke, yet from that horror came understanding. In the cold silence of the ocean floor, where the Yamato rests, the story is carved in rust and coral, even the greatest power must bow to time and change. And above that same ocean, where supercarriers now glide like floating cities, another truth shines, that human creativity, when freed from fear and guided by purpose, can achieve anything. The Pacific War ended in surrender, but its legacy endures in every jet that takes off from a carrier deck, in every alliance that prevents another war, and in every engineer who dares to build something new. The Essex-Class carriers were not only America's victory, they were humanity's leap forward, proof that evolution does not stop at biology, but extends to every tool, every idea, every nation willing to dream beyond the limits of its past. The 18 battleships Japan sent to war are gone, their names fading into history. But the idea they opposed, the idea that the future belongs to innovation, sails on, proud and eternal, across the endless blue that once divided the world, and now unites it.